Right, I've been trying for the last 4 or 5 days to get a video out about Heathcliff and about Wuthering Heights, but it's just proving bloody impossible because there's too much to talk about, right? And it's because I love Heathcliff so much and I love Wuthering Heights so much that I keep not wanting to butcher the damn video. But this is my last attempt. I can't keep doing this. This is becoming obsessive now and I'm losing my mind. So I imagine a number of you will have seen my video on the tenant of Wildfell Hall last week, in which I had initially set out to talk about Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre all in the same video before quickly realising that that was beyond my abilities. But under that video in the comments section, everyone was talking about Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre, and it sounds like a lot of people want to hear my opinions on those books. And I had to make the one about Wuthering Heights first because I think of the three books that we're talking about here, that's my favourite. Something caught my attention in the comments section. Quite a lot of you quite vexed me. A lot of you in your comments said that you didn't like Wuthering Heights, that you couldn't get into it, it was boring, you didn't like any of the characters.
Are you crazy? Are you out of your mind?
I obviously disagree, and hopefully I'm going to be able to change some of your minds with this video. Now, I'm no literary expert in any sense, but the only thing that occurs to me that could be a potential reason why people can't get into the novel is perhaps the perception they have of Heathcliff and of Wuthering Heights before they start reading it, and then they read the first chapter. Maybe the first chapter tricks you a little bit, you know, the first or second chapter perhaps lead you to think that it's going to be boring, because it's not boring. So just before I get into why Wuthering Heights is not boring and why Heathcliff is one of the greatest characters of all time, I'm just going to qualify what I said there, and I'm gonna do this right now. Don't you love it when in videos people say what they're going to say? They introduce what they're gonna say, but then they don't seem to get round to saying it. I'm so self-aware sometimes it makes me blush. But anyway, the perspective that people might have of Wuthering Heights before they read it. In my case, I didn't start reading until I was in my early 20s, and I started by reading the classics. You know, I thought, get the classics out the way. I'm in my mid-30s now, and still haven't got them out the way. There's quite a lot of them. But yeah, that was my idea anyway. So I started reading Jane Austen novels. I read Pride and Prejudice, I read Emma, and then Wuthering Heights. I always liked the song by Kate Bush, you know, and I thought, oh, that sounds like Jane Austen, but people describe it as a gothic novel. I bet it's like Jane Austen, but all gloomy and stuff, and out on the wily misty moors, eh? You had a temper like my jealousy, too hot, too greedy. And then the upbeat chorus, and I'm really being serious now, the song influenced what I thought about the book before I read it, you know? Heathcliff, it's me, your Cathy, I've come home. Let me in your window. I thought it was, you know, going to be a Romeo and Juliet-esque romance. You know, they couldn't get it together, but they needed to be together, and I don't know, and it would be sort of like an on and off thing all the way through. I thought, oh, how romantic, I'll give that a go. Well, sorry for the spoilers that I'm going to give away in this video, but that is not what Wuthering Heights is. And I don't know about the rest of you, but going into the novel, I also had a sort of preconception, an idea of who Heathcliff or what Heathcliff was going to be. You know, this sort of dark, brooding, handsome, gentlemanly figure who's a bit aloof, a bit standoffish, you know, and that he's very passionate, you know, has a temper on him. That's what I'm expecting of him. And having read Jane Austen, I'm expecting, you know, he's going to be kind of Mr. Darcy, but a bit more gothic. Yeah, that was totally wrong. I think another thing that doesn't help inspire people to read Wuthering Heights is all of the abysmal film versions of the story. First of all, I never get the delusions of grandeur that producers and directors have of trying to reduce a 30-chapter novel into a 2-hour film. It's never going to work. To get people to empathise with Heathcliff, you need at least to have a series of 10 episodes that are each an hour long. Otherwise, people are just not going to get it. And I don't know what's worse, the films that stop halfway through the story, or the ones that just go a little bit longer and try to put the other half of the novel in there as well. And I'm talking about Wuthering Heights here specifically. I'm sure they do it with others as well, but there's just like, there's a cut-off point in the story, which I'm going to get to, where you can just go, yeah, we'll end it there. The whole second part of the novel is really important to understanding Heathcliff. So anyone who's ever seen any substantial portion of any of the film versions of Wuthering Heights, whether that be Laurence Olivier playing Heathcliff or Timothy Dalton or Ralph Fiennes or Tom Hardy, I think they'd just be put off the novel for life. Plus, as a producer, it's not like 19th century Gothic novels are an easy sell, so to make them consumer friendly, they cut out all of the nastiness, which again is essential to understanding Heathcliff. Then I think the final problem is if you've got all of this sort of cultural perception of what Wuthering Heights is going into the novel, the first chapter could trick you a little bit into thinking that that is exactly what you're about to read. In the opening chapter, we're essentially just introduced to the narrator, Mr. Lockwood, who we know is the new tenant of Thrushcross Grange, which is the nearest house to Wuthering Heights, where Heathcliff, his landlord, lives. And he makes a trip over to go and see him. He walks the 4 miles up the road to go and see Heathcliff. So we're introduced to Heathcliff through the first impressions of the narrator, Mr. Lockwood, who takes a bit of a liking initially to Heathcliff because, well, he sees him as a bit of a recluse, a bit standoffish, and he says, well, similar to myself, you know. Mr. Lockwood describes himself as a bit of a misanthrope, you know, somebody who can't quite enjoy society, and he's moved out to the country, and he's happy that he's got a neighbour like Heathcliff. And so it's exactly what we're expecting, you know, this sort of very serious man who's probably got a lot of emotion under the surface once we get to it. But it's so much more than that. And I think if people could just hang on until chapter 3, they'd be hooked. In the second chapter, Mr. Lockwood visits Wuthering Heights again. He visits Heathcliff again, and we're introduced to a couple of other characters who are a bit mysterious. We don't really know much about them. We meet Heathcliff's daughter-in-law, called Catherine. So that's a bit confusing because you're thinking, well, isn't the love interest Catherine? What's going on there? And another teenage boy called Hareton, who we don't know much about, who's apparently a servant. And, well, we'll get to them later. But in the second chapter, well, or the third chapter, not quite sure, I can't remember. Not that important, is it really? Heathcliff's gone to bed and Mr. Lockwood tries to return home, but he's snowed in. There's a snowstorm. And so he's forced to stay the night there, but Heathcliff doesn't know he's staying the night there. And the housekeeper Zillah leads Mr. Lockwood to a mysterious bedroom, right, that nobody is allowed to go into. It's like the West Wing in Beauty and the Beast. Ugh, very scary, right? And so Mr. Lockwood goes into this very sort of haunted looking room and immediately notices the name Catherine engraved or scratched into the windowsill in various forms. Catherine Earnshaw, Catherine Linton, Catherine Heathcliff. And then he notices a pile of diaries which he starts reading by Catherine Earnshaw that he describes as being about a quarter of a century old. So he opens the diary, one of them, and starts reading an entry from one day, and it's immediately obvious that Catherine was a child when she wrote these, and she was very good friends with Heathcliff, and that they spent a lot of time together playing as kids. This is just an entry from one day, and avoiding Catherine's violent older brother Hindley and the despotic servant who's still the eldest servant at Wuthering Heights, Joseph. I think it's just important that I describe this in some detail, this scene, because it's kind of important. Mr. Lockwood falls asleep and he starts to have these weird fever dreams about Joseph and other people. and he's woken up by the sound of scratching on the window, right? And so he gets up to see what's going on, and believing it's a branch, you know, from the tree scraping against the window, and he wants to open the window to move the branch, but he'd forgotten that the window is soldered shut. And so he weirdly puts his hand through the glass, smashes the glass to remove the branch, when he suddenly feels the icy cold hand of a young girl and sees through the window, looking back at him, the ghost of Catherine begging him to let her in. Mr. Lockwood is naturally terrified and begins trying to free himself, but she won't let go of him. And so he cuts her wrists on the broken glass and sees that there's blood all over the bed, and then piles up all the diaries against the hole in the window, and then the diaries all start falling down. Of course he's dreaming, right? He's having a fever dream, but he's screaming about Catherine, telling Catherine to go away, because he's been reading the diaries, right? He knows who Catherine is, and he thinks that that's the ghost of Catherine. And Heathcliff, this is where we see the other side of him, or one of the other sides of him. He comes into the room terrified with a candle, saying, "Who's there?" You know, he doesn't know anyone's there. He didn't know Mr. Lockwood had stayed the night. And so, of course, he thinks the room's haunted. And Mr. Lockwood says, "It's haunted, that girl, Catherine." And, of course, Mr. Heathcliff is no longer his composed, controlled, brooding self. He's reduced to tears. It appears that he's crying, says Mr. Lockwood, and he's finding it hard to breathe. He gets Mr. Lockwood to go. He says, "Go and pace around the yard, do whatever you want." And thinking Mr. Lockwood has gone, he bursts into tears and starts screaming at the window and begging Catherine to come back to him, begging her to haunt him. Now that's important for the rest of the book, because this is where we start to get into the backstory. Now, some people think of Heathcliff as a villain, but as with any great villain, they have to have a good backstory, and he really does. There's certainly a lot of mitigating circumstances, or at least explanations as to why he becomes as villainous as he does. And for me, throughout the entire story, he has the potential to be good, and he wants to be good. And I would argue that though he does some evil things, the good in him probably outweighs the bad. Now, to me, Heathcliff is really interesting because he represents a lot of different literary archetypes in one person, in one character. And the first thing, and the most obvious thing about him, is that he's an outcast. Right from the very beginning, his origin is unknown. We only know that Mr. Earnshaw, Cathy and Hindley's father, the owners of Wuthering Heights, the father of the family is on business one day in Liverpool and finds a young gypsy child roaming the streets who can barely speak, and he takes pity on him and puts him under his coat and walks back to Yorkshire 60 miles in the rain. There were different times back then, you know. Probably couldn't get away with doing that now, could you? So much red tape. But yeah, he does that, and we know that obviously he's an orphan, he's abandoned, and he's taken back to his adopted family, who also reject him, you know, initially, and particularly the older brother, the biological son of Mr. Earnshaw, Hindley, Catherine's older brother. Catherine learns to love Heathcliff fairly quickly, and they become inseparable. But Hindley physically abuses Heathcliff throughout his childhood. One of the things that breaks my heart as a parent reading the story is that Heathcliff can take the physical punishment really, really well because he's so used to it. Like right from the beginning, it doesn't seem to affect him when Hindley hits him with heavy objects or punches him or smashes his head against the wall. It just doesn't, he'll just sort of rub himself and get on with it. So a lot of different things happen, but the one thing you have to essentially understand about Heathcliff is he can take any amount of punishment, but what he can't take is being separated from Catherine. He can't stand the idea of Catherine not loving him. And what Heathcliff has got going for him is that Catherine does love him, and his adopted father, Mr. Earnshaw, actually loves Heathcliff more than his biological children. So for a brief time in his childhood, things can be said to be going well, more or less. Hindley and Catherine's mother, Mrs. Earnshaw, actually never really warms to Heathcliff, but she dies, and so the last person that really supports Hindley in the house is gone. He has no allies, and his father, as he's getting older, can not tolerate the way his biological son Hindley bullies and abuses Heathcliff, and so he ends up sending Hindley away to boarding school. But Heathcliff's life is destined to be one long tragedy, and when things appear to be going well, they just take a turn for the worse every single time. And what happens is his adopted father, Mr. Earnshaw, dies a few years later, and Hindley comes back to Wuthering Heights with his new bride, an idiot of a woman who hates Heathcliff as much as he does. And so the abuse begins all over again. But not only that, he is no longer treated as a brother, as an equal in the family. He's relegated to servant, and even worse than that, a field labourer. But one of the most admirable things about the young Heathcliff is that he is capable of taking all of this punishment and suffering so long as he's got Cathy, right? He almost laughs about it. He can take the physical punishment. He's really tough mentally and physically, and he's just waiting for things to get better. And he knows that if he just gets all of his chores done, Hindley will kind of leave him alone, and he can go out and play with Cathy on the moors, as they like to do. Skipping forward a little bit though, we're introduced to the Linton family, who live at Thrushcross Grange, which is where Mr. Lockwood is now living in the present day. And the Linton family are a boy and a girl, about the age of Heathcliff and Cathy, but they're much posher, you know, and not so uncouth as those two. And they take a liking to Cathy, and they take her in to their house for 5 weeks leading up to Christmas one year. And it's yet another incident where Heathcliff is just rejected by society. He is once again shown to be an outcast. They don't accept him at all. They don't want him anywhere near their kids. They don't want him anywhere near Cathy. And again, he takes it with good humour. He doesn't care. He knows that Cathy belongs to him, and it doesn't matter. It's great if she goes and spends time with those posh kids, and they teach her to dress and to clean herself properly, and they teach her better table manners and all of that kind of thing. He thinks that's wonderful. He couldn't care less, because he knows that the real Cathy is the Cathy he knows, playing barefoot on the moors with him. When Cathy returns to Wuthering Heights on Christmas Eve, though, she greets Heathcliff as she always would have, hugging him and kissing him. But she remarks on how dirty he looks compared to the Lintons, and that is something that he can't take. He cannot bear to be compared to the Lintons, and feel that Cathy feels that someone is superior to him. And there's, to me, a really important scene in the book, which is a conversation between Heathcliff and the housekeeper Nellie, and it's after Heathcliff has reacted so badly to what Cathy said to him, you know, about him being dirty. You know, that night he sort of sulks, he won't eat his dinner, and then the next day he's walking out with Nellie, doing some chore, and he shows his vulnerable side for the first time ever. He says, "I wish I was more like Edgar Linton. You know, I wish I was fair-haired and fair-skinned and blue-eyed, and I wish I was rich." And he shows that vulnerability to Nellie, because he's obviously becoming jealous of Edgar, because Cathy is starting to spend more time with him. And for the first time in his life, somebody, Nellie, the housekeeper in this case, for the first time in Heathcliff's life, he's given some real encouragement. She says, "What are you jealous of Edgar Linton for? You're a year younger than him, but you're taller than him, and you've got twice the breadth in your shoulders. And what are you jealous of? His origin? We don't know your origin. Maybe your father was an emperor of China, and your mother a queen of India, or something like that," she says to him. "For all you know, they're vastly inferior to you. And if you just cleaned yourself up and wore the right clothes and combed your hair a bit, you'd be better looking than him as well." And that's the amazing thing, and the sad thing really, is the way he reacts to that positive encouragement. He's never had it before, and he reacts positively and says, well, help me. I'll be good. I'll do whatever I need to do. Just make me look presentable, and I'll be good. He repeats it. And what he's wanting is to have dinner with the Lintons, who are coming to Wuthering Heights for Christmas dinner. And so she does help him. Nellie helps him to look presentable and takes him to go and have dinner with the Lintons and with Cathy. But Hindley finds him and tells him to get lost, to get into the attic and not come down until everyone's gone. Edgar Linton makes some remark about his hair, about Heathcliff's hair, and he throws boiling applesauce in his face. And I'm really rooting for Heathcliff here. And Cathy is as well. Cathy at this point is still defending him, and she's saying, why did you say anything to him? And she can't stand the fact that Edgar's such a wuss, you know, he's crying. She says, you're not going to die, are you? You've just got applesauce in your face. You know, and now Heathcliff's going to get beaten because of you. You know, she really has disdain for him, but cutting a long story short, she does end up spending more and more time with Edgar Linton, and Heathcliff one night overhears a conversation in which Cathy tells Nellie, the housekeeper, that she intends to marry Edgar Linton, and that she can't marry Heathcliff because it would be to degrade herself, because he's been relegated to such a lowly station. And Heathcliff just leaves. He immediately runs away from Wuthering Heights, apparently never to return. And Cathy spends the whole night out in the rain, crying, looking for him on the moors, and gets very, very sick, but is taken in by the Lintons and recovers. And 2.5 years later, she gets married to Edgar Linton. And 6 months after they're married, mysteriously, Heathcliff returns a gentleman. He left a boy, he returns a man. He's very tall, strong, handsome. He has gentlemanly airs, and he's apparently very wealthy. And we never learn how that change occurred. But I think it's representative of his love, the power of his love, the ability to transform himself completely so that he is superior in every way to Edgar Linton. He does that over a 3-year period, and it's seemingly impossible. Nobody knows how he could have acquired wealth, how he could have acquired these gentlemanly airs. Nobody understands it, but it's the power of his love for Cathy that did it. He's willing to overcome, he's able to overcome any obstacle to be worthy of Cathy. But of course, Cathy's married to Edgar Linton. Anyway, this video is getting very long now at this point, so I think I'm going to try and wrap it up as succinctly as I can. Basically, at this point, the story starts to get extremely dark and messy, because Heathcliff has come back and he can't get what he wants and what he feels he deserves, and so, of course, starts to take his revenge on all of his enemies. And there was something I skipped over, which is a slightly important detail, which I think again shows, I think it's a detail that's added in the book to show that the good does overcome the evil in Heathcliff. And I think it's a moment when Hindley, his abuser, his wife dies in childbirth, giving birth to Hareton. And Hindley becomes massively alcoholic after that point and completely abandons his son to the care of Nellie, the housekeeper. And one night, in fact the night when Heathcliff finds out that Cathy is going to marry Edgar Linton, that same night Hindley had come home violently drunk and had taken his baby Hareton and dropped him over the banister, and Heathcliff had actually saved his life. He happened to be there and caught him. That's an important detail, because it's just, I think the idea there is, there's something about how even when he's doing something evil, there's some kind of sense of justice guiding him. So he's back in the neighbourhood all these, several years later, and this is where obviously Edgar and Heathcliff hate each other. They're both vying for Cathy, but she's married to Edgar, right? Cathy is essentially at this point driven mad by not being able to be with Heathcliff and can't really do anything about it. And Heathcliff, as he can't do anything about it, starts to take revenge on, Hindley to start with. He finds Hindley is completely alcoholic at this point after the 3 years. In the 3 years that he's been away, he's become very desperate, has a massive gambling addiction, and Heathcliff encourages all of this behaviour and gets him further into debt so that he can buy Wuthering Heights off him. And then he essentially has his former abuser under his power and just wants to destroy him and humiliate him as much as he can. To get back at Edgar Linton, he elopes with his sister Isabella, who he humiliates in every way possible at Wuthering Heights, and she ends up escaping to London, pregnant with Heathcliff's child. Cathy is driven insane by all of this, and she also falls violently ill and dies in childbirth, giving birth to Edgar Linton's child. And this, of course, just pushes Heathcliff over the edge, and evil starts to get a bit of a stranglehold over his personality. He becomes as much of a monster as he can be at this point, and he starts to maliciously plan he schemes how to get revenge on the descendants of the Earnshaws and the Lintons, and he finds that he has a son in London. Isabella has died. This is many years later. He has a 12-year-old son he finds now. Cathy and Edgar Linton's daughter, Cathy Linton, is about the same age, and he encourages a relationship between those two. And Hareton, the son of Hindley at Wuthering Heights, he relegates him to a field labourer. To the field, you infernal calf. And he's trying to he's trying to take revenge on the DNA of the people who ruined his life. And he encourages a relationship between Cathy Linton, who's living at Thrushcross Grange, and his own son, which he takes custody of at Wuthering Heights. His own son is very sickly. He has some kind of degenerative illness. It's probably cystic fibrosis or something like that. What we call it nowadays, I don't know. But it doesn't specify. He encourages a relationship between those two, and they eventually marry. And he, at that point, has all of them hostage at Wuthering Heights. Edgar Linton dies. Hindley, many years previous, has been forced to drink himself to death by Heathcliff, essentially. I keep saying essentially, I think, don't I? Tired. I'm essentially tired. And he realises that no amount of revenge ever gives him any amount of satisfaction. And there's this strange sense that people can still see some good in him. Hareton, for example, who's been mistreated by Heathcliff now all of his life, loves Heathcliff like a father, even though he mistreats him. Cathy says to him, she confronts him, Cathy Linton, his daughter-in-law, after his son has died. His son eventually dies from his illness. she confronts him saying, "You must love us. I know that you love us. I know that you have love in you." And he says, "I hate you all." He confesses to Nellie, the housekeeper, that he's never in any way got over Kathy, and that he was driven so mad, so desperate for her to come to him, for her to haunt him, that he dug up her corpse just to be with her. So it gets pretty dark. But I don't see how it couldn't. I don't see how he couldn't turn into a monster of sorts. But it always feels to me throughout the novel that he could be so much more evil than he was. And when he's confronted by Kathy Linton, it's right at the end of the novel, he seems to implode in on himself. He doesn't have the power in him to beat her, or to attack anyone anymore, or to take any more revenge, and he just stops eating and sleeping and locks himself in Catherine Earnshaw's bedroom and dies. We're not sure how he dies, but he dies. And Hareton's devastated by it, interestingly. Hindley's son, who he's abused. And the nice poetic ending to the story is that Hareton, who is almost a reincarnation of Heathcliff, though there's no blood relation, marries the girl, marries Kathy, who was just like her mother, Catherine Earnshaw. And so there's almost a weirdly happy ending to one of the darkest stories you could ever read. And I don't know, that's my that's my odd defence of Heathcliff. I've probably missed tons of stuff I needed to talk about, but it's just, I've been going over this for days, and maybe I've butchered it, but it's not going to get any better than this. Oh, Jesus. I'm done.